And boy, we have a great show. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So glad you could be with us here today. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton wanted big wins in New York, and they got them. Both frontrunners meeting or exceeding expectations in the high-stakes New York primary. The delegate haul pushing both White House hopefuls closer to locking up their party's nominations. Now the race shifts to our area, to Maryland. Our panel weighs in a moment, but first, correspondent Bazi Kanani has the latest from New York.
New York, New York.
The Big Apple delivers must-wins for the presidential frontrunners.
I can think of nowhere that I would rather have this victory.
Today, you proved once again there's no place like home.
Hillary Clinton wins by double digits and takes more than half of the delegates at stake, a blow to Bernie Sanders' recent momentum.
The race for the Democratic nomination is in the home stretch and victory is in sight.
Humongous crowds for Sanders didn't translate at the polls. He blames the state's primary system for denying independent voters.
I would hope that in future primary elections in New York State, the officials there make some fundamental changes about how they do business.
On the Republican side, an even bigger victory for Donald Trump, who walks away with nearly all of the 95 delegates at stake.
We don't have much of a race anymore. Senator Cruz is just about mathematically eliminated.
But Ted Cruz disagrees, brushing off his third-place loss.
And now, my friends, onward to victory.
Both Cruz and John Kasich pushing forward, hoping to win at a contested convention.
Nobody's going to get enough delegates.
And the candidates are back on the trail with 5 states in the Northeast holding contests next Tuesday. Bazi Kanani, ABC News, Washington.
Joining us now from our D.C. Bureau, ABC7 Chief Political Correspondent Scott Thuman, and with us here in the studio, political reporter Dan Lippman. Gentlemen, welcome. Good to have you here. Scott, let me begin with you. Are we seeing on the Republican side an emergence of Donald Trump coming out of his big showing in New York as a suddenly more likely first ballot nominee in Cleveland?
Going to change too much as far as those who've already made up their minds about how they're going to handle a first ballot just because he won New York. It was an expected victory. It was a large one. It was resounding in just about every aspect. But those delegates that we talked about yesterday, Bruce, who've been aligning, hoping for a second ballot attempt because they are Cruz supporters, they're not going to change their mind just because of what we saw in New York. Now, Donald Trump's going to package it as such and say that everyone else should essentially get out because they're mathematically almost impossible scenarios for those other candidates to reach the 1237 before the convention. But I don't know if that's going to change a ton so far.
Dan Lippman.
Sure. What's interesting about last night is that it gets Trump closer, but he's still not a lock for the nomination. We had a story in Politico today reporting about how actually if he doesn't even reach 1237, he still has a good chance because there's about 200 unbound delegates. So if he's only within 50 or 100, you know, the party's going to say, should we really deprive the person who the voters want? And, you know, he can sew it up pretty quickly. He can offer whatever he wants to these unbound delegates.
Up until now, the idea that you could win the nomination on the first ballot, even if you're shy of 1237, and we're not talking generically now, mathematically, we're only talking about one person, Donald Trump. The idea that you could be close but not across the line and sort of qualify or be deemed to have earned it was something that some in the Trump camp, that some of his most passionate supporters were advancing as a kind of a logical way of thinking about all this. Has that pivoted? Has that shifted in recent days? Is that becoming more of a general idea that this is how it should play out?
I guess the narrative that I'm seeing is that you would see such a rebellion among the party if you basically have a candidate that has really earned the nomination if it keeps going, and they don't want to, have. The party is already divided into two camps, basically, the Trump and the anti-Trump, and the party is already falling behind Hillary in the polls for November. And so, do you really want to create more turmoil and division, or should you try to unite the party? And if Trump continues to do well like he did last night, then he has a credible case to make that he should be the nominee.
Scott, a pivotal moment for GOP leaders from the chairman on down on this issue of what do you do if Mr. Trump is close to, but not across the line?
Yeah, look, the hand-wringing that's got to be going on at the RNC is pretty intense. They had never envisioned this particular scenario, as they've stated publicly before, but at the same time, they're trying to remain these impartial arbiters of the whole thing. They have to stand up there and say we're running a convention that's open and honest, that nothing is rigged, as the allegations have been from Donald Trump's campaign over and over, and that it's a fair process and the rules apply to everyone. They're going to continue with that mantra and that motto, as they should. It doesn't change the fact that Trump supporters are going to say that this is somehow a them at a disadvantage and that it was all constructed to keep him from getting the nomination. You're going to hear Ted Cruz really now focus, though, on what's next, as well as John Kasich, and that's the 5 states coming up where they hope that they can steal a couple of victories. Ted Cruz, prior to New York, had quite a few successes, albeit smaller states. And he and John Kasich are going to look at places like Pennsylvania and Maryland, where there are a lot of delegates still up for grabs, and see if they can stop some of the slide that now looks like it may occur more in favor of Donald Trump.
Let's talk about the Democrats. Scott, you first, and then Dan Lippman here in the studio. Scott, is there a new pressure coming out of the New York primary for Bernie Sanders to get back in the win column fast, or begin a calculation within himself about what sort of damage he does to the party's nominee by continuing on when he can't get to the magic number of Democratic delegates?
Yeah, and that's the message that we've been hearing from Robbie Mook on Hillary Clinton's campaign team, saying that at some point does it start to damage her as a candidate and the party at whole if Bernie Sanders remains in and is in attack dog mode against Clinton. Now, what we're going to look at is whether or not this quote that came from the campaign this morning really has some substance. They said that he will reassess where everything stands after next Tuesday, after those 5 states of Delaware, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, and Pennsylvania vote. If Bernie Sanders gets just destroyed in those states, and we're not saying he necessarily will, but if he did, does he then scale back a little bit from this continual line that he is going to go all the way to the convention? He certainly is going to have the donors, he's going to have the support, and delegate-wise, he's still very much in the race. But you do have to wonder at that point, mathematically, optically, and then as far as the unifying of the party, to what degree do you want to gamble? Hillary Clinton last night made it pretty clear it was probably the furthest she's gone in saying that the finish line's in sight, that the nomination is within reach, and kind of saying it's time.
Dan Lippman, how do you see the Democratic nomination fight being impacted by her big win? A lot of the bar setting revolved around, would she beat Bernie Sanders by double digits? She did, 16, very impressive. They both had connections to the Empire State. She won in very impressive fashion. How does the race as a whole, how has the race as a whole been impacted by the New York vote?
I think she's pretty, I bet she's really glad that she ran for that Senate seat in New York, in 2000 and 2006. As for the race going forward, I think this is a huge shot in the arm because it gives her backers and the big shots in the Democratic Party a case to make that Sanders should eventually step out of the race because they want Hillary to focus on the general election. One interesting data point from the exit polls last night is that most Democrats feel that they've been energized by the race, and Republicans feel like their race has divided the party. And so it won't be that tough to bring Sanders supporters into the fold if Clinton wins the nomination. And another interesting part is that I think that Sanders he can claim victory in that he has elevated the issues that he cares about, the economic inequality, the anti-Wall Street rhetoric, that's what Hillary is talking about too. And so that's, to be able to shape the platform of Hillary's campaign against the probable Republican nominee, that's a victory for Sanders.
Scott, picking up on Dan's point there, Hillary Clinton's ability to woo Bernie Sanders' most fervent supporters, particularly the young, I think remains for many as something to watch. Can she close this deal as parties choose their nominees and we get to the general?
Yeah, and that's a big challenge for her campaign, not just here in the primary process, but say Bernie Sanders is out of it, and if there were a general election scenario in which it's Hillary Clinton versus whoever it may be from the Republican Party, yes, that is a task that they have to figure out. How do you galvanize those younger voters that are Bernie Sanders supporters? It doesn't mean they're necessarily going to say, well, I'm still going to go to the polls in November because I want a Democrat to win office. A lot of them were Bernie Sanders supporters, not necessarily Democratic supporters. And to Daniel's point that I thought was interesting, he's right. Look, Hillary Clinton moved to Chapco 15 years ago and made that her home. That's when she kind of did her own carpetbagging. Last night we heard an interesting line from Bernie Sanders in his kind of defeat comments when he said, well, we lost to her in her home state. Bernie Sanders from Brooklyn. It's no mystery that he has New York connections, but it's one more way that he can kind of say, look, some of these things are out of our control, but we've put up a good fight. So if, for example, he does get out, if we want to play that hypothetical, Daniel's right. He can say, I've really elevated the conversation. I've made a race where no one thought it was humanly possible. And so there is a victory in a defeat for him. And he can feel like he's really furthered the party's cause.
Talking with our chief political correspondent, Scott Thuman, and with Daniel Lippman, co-author of the Politico Playbook. We'll take a break here. We're back, though, with more news talk for this Wednesday, right after this.